Drew here, and there's this sequence near the beginning of the pilot episode that just aired on HBO of The Nevers. And it's the sequence in which the main characters are running from bad guys through Victorian era London in this contraption that is very much a steampunk style vehicle, and they're speeding through the streets. And I feel like this sequence, in some ways, could be seen as a metaphor for the whole show because in this sequence, it's very well realized. They're moving at a good clip, but they can't really stop and linger on anything. Everything around them, there's a lot of interesting stuff. There's a lot of interesting people that they're passing and a lot of interesting locations, but they just gotta keep moving. And you can't say that you're really not entertained by the journey, but you kind of wish that they would slow down and just take in the sights and the sounds and kind of take in what's going on around them. And I feel like that's kind of what the show feels like to me on the whole. It's not that I was ever bored. I was entertained the whole time, but I feel like it's just got a little bit too much busyness going on. And some of this is just possibly pilot issues, I feel, because generally speaking, series, especially near the beginning, when they're trying to make sure they keep the audience's attention, sometimes they try to be like, well, look at this is in the show too, and oh, this is in the show, and you should really realize that this is in the show as well. And sometimes in doing that, I feel that they risk not really having the time to focus on any one thing adequately. So the basic premise of this show, for those of you who don't know, like I said, is taking place in Victorian era London. And essentially, there's been this big mysterious event that gave a bunch of different individuals, and there's not really any clear pattern to this, although there is there are some suggestive aspects of it, but it's given a bunch of different individuals powers, and the people that have these powers are said to be touched. And the powers don't really seem to have much rhyme or reason to them. They're somewhat akin to magic in that regard. It's just like people can do things, and like I said, the show moves at a good clip, so it doesn't really explore in too much detail at this point how the powers work. It just kind of seems to be like, well, and here's another power, and here's another power. And in that regard, and in the way that it's using these powers perhaps as a metaphor for the plight of the marginalized in society, I feel like this show has a very, very obvious similarity to the X-Men franchise. It honestly reminded me more of Miss Peregrine's Home for Peculiar Children, but that one was very X-Men derivative as well, so I'm going to give the X-Men credit for this. But it feels very X-Men-y if you had the X-Men in Victorian England with a side of steampunk. And the main characters, there's a number of different threats that they're facing. First, they're facing the societal threat because the stodgy old white male patriarchy is not happy with the changed status quo that these powers that have particularly, for the most part, been granted to marginalized groups, with exceptions, are kind of changing the status quo. So rather than allow the status quo to change, they're trying to kind of exclude the people that have been given these powers. They're trying to argue that it's an attack on traditional values and on traditional societal structures. And of course, there's a crazed, touched person called Malady who seems to want to enact vengeance on those who have mistreated her in the past. And how the main characters, find themselves in conflict with these individuals and also with a mysterious group that seems to be kidnapping the touched. All this is kind of a little bit hazy at first, and I'm sure the connections are going to become more clear as the series goes on. But as I said, this is very, very busy, and you kind of just wish that it would slow down and give you a little bit more time to take things in. I feel that, this is a good time if you don't mind not thinking too hard about it. Because I think if you want to think hard about it, a lot of this stuff isn't as well developed as it could be. Now, a lot of people are having a hard time looking past the fact that this show bears all Joss Whedon's signature touches. It very much feels like a Joss Whedon show. I think if it didn't feel like that, the discussion about Joss Whedon, who, in case you didn't know, has created kind of a hubbub for the way he's allegedly mistreated people in the past. And it seems, based on the fact that there's so many people saying it about him, that it's almost definitely true that he has had kind of an abusive personality on set. Now, I feel personally there's a thin line between uh, unacceptable abusive behavior and behavior where it's like, oh, he's just so talented and he doesn't know how to work with people. Like in the past, I feel like people like Whedon would have gotten a pass, but at this point in time, he's not getting one from anyone. And I feel like there's a degree to which, like, if you're not able to look past his involvement, and it's hard because he definitely has, like I said, his fingerprints are all over this thing. If you're not able to look past that, then it's going to be a challenge, to say the least, to enjoy this show, because the dialogue is very, very Whedon-esque. It's very, very patter-patter. It has kind of his post-progressive politics, as Red Letter Media would call it. And it's, just very, very in the world building, in the way that everything is kind of a mile wide and an inch deep. It just feels very Whedon-esque, as I said. And so if all these things, it's just harder to look past his involvement because his involvement is so obvious. But I'm not going to go on and on about it because HBO has given him his walking papers. So if you feel that, you don't want to support Whedon, I feel like you can at this point say, well, I'm not really supporting him because he's been given his walking papers. I'm supporting the other people that were involved with this show. So I personally can look past it. If you can't, I understand. I could especially understand because, as I said, his touch is so obvious in this show. Now, the title of this show, The Nevers, never really gets explained. I find that I personally really, really enjoyed this show. I have found in the past that Whedon shows and films, they tend to be really, really breezy entertainment. Like I said, if you don't think about it too hard, it's pretty enjoyable. I do feel that there's a certain superficiality to the proceedings. I would complain, in the past, I have felt that Whedon would sacrifice character development for a good line, for a good one-liner, but here I didn't really feel like that was the case. The dialogue is, pretty catchy. There's a lot of good zingers where people have good rejoinders and comebacks, and that's, obviously very Whedon-esque. There's one sequence at a opera house where you have multiple different characters having a conversation, and the way that they all come in and out of the conversation, and they're kind of all establishing their characters and their motivations and having these snappy comebacks. I felt like the most Whedon-esque scene of the bunch. It almost was hearkening back to the scene in Avengers where it's just panning around the room as the different characters, come back at each other and talk about where they're coming from within the given situation. I don't think that there are really any interesting, characters in this show at the moment. I mean, from the perspective of, I find the actors interesting. Yeah, there's a lot of characters where I'm intrigued by the actors. It has, as most HBO shows do, just an amazing cast that, you're kind of stunned that they have people like Tom Riley and James Norton and Eleanor Tomlinson and Nick Frost in this cast. You're kind of like, what are they doing here? In roles that are at this moment not that well defined. I personally find Tom Riley as Augustus Bidlow to be one of the more intriguing characters because I don't want to spoil anything until the latter half of this review, but let's just say that he's intriguing to me because he's like this very, very awkward and very, very traditional type who yet somehow seems to be caught up in the touched and in their plight. And I find it interesting because the question of why exactly he is involved with them, I'm interested in seeing them explore that. I also feel that the two leads are particularly strong. I really like Lauren Donnelly as Amelia True. I think that Lauren Donnelly, to me, she kind of comes off as like a Victorian Kristen Ritter in this role. I feel that, she's got a drinking problem. She seems like she has some social issues. She's very good at the fisticuffs. And she has kind of this tormented aspect. It seems that she was committing suicide at the beginning of the story when she received her abilities, and that's what led her to change her mind after she received these abilities, and what brought her to such a desperate plight. I think will be interesting for the series to explore. I also very much like Anna Skelly as Penance Adair. I think that her character comes off as very likable, and while they haven't really given her as much development yet as they have Amelia True, I'm interested to see how their friendship plays out. I think that these actresses are both very likable and intriguing. They're also both very attractive. On the whole, I feel like this show, like I mentioned, the word that I would use to describe it would be past progressive, as Red Letter Media would say. And part of the reason for that is while there's obviously this very, very strong subtext about, taking down the patriarchy and, standing up for the plight of those who are marginalized in society, it all feels very dated to me. It doesn't feel like a show coming out in 2021. It feels like something that could have come out in the early thousands even. So to me, this isn't a negative or a positive from my perspective. I'm just making an observation that this isn't a very risky show. It's a very much just a populist piece of entertainment that's calibrated to be, somewhat progressive, but not so progressive that it's off-putting in the way that something like Lovecraft Country and some other recent shows could be to people. So to me, I find it interesting how it's not really a risky project, as I said. I also feel like it's kind of dubious that you have so many Americans involved behind the scenes. I think, it's good that they have English writers and such, but whenever you have the main voice of a show, controversy aside, I feel like having Joss Whedon be the writer is a little bit iffy because I don't know that he understands the cultural aspects of English culture that well. This very much feels like a theme park version of England to me, where, yeah, maybe they have the right accents and stuff, but it doesn't really feel well realized from a cultural perspective. I don't feel like the characters act like they're actually living in Victorian England. Now, to give some spoilers, I thought that the aforementioned chase sequence was pretty strong. I have a bit of a question about why Amelia True is so good at fist fighting and why she's always, jumping in to these combat scenes and how we're supposed to buy this. In this era, I understand that it's a fantasy series, fantasy steampunk series, but to me, it still comes off as rather contrived and networky, that she's always jumping into these fights and that she's quite competent at it. I also feel that, like I said, I think there's a little bit too much going on. I think particularly the fact that we have, one group of people kidnapping the Touched, and they're apparently being led by Dennis O'Hare, and we don't really know what's going on with them yet. But you've got that going on. You've got obviously the oppressive patriarchy. You've got this serial killer angle. You've got so much going on that it's a little bit hard to get your bearings and to keep track of which threat is which. And they've done a good job of coming up with reasons for Amelia and her friend to have to, be involved in these situations. They, have a touched person played by Eleanor Tomlinson get kidnapped at this opera show. And this person, they give you insight into this in the behind the scenes documentary, apparently has the power to show the touched who the other touched are and to make you feel the sense of connection to others. But the reason that she gets kidnapped, I think that because they're dealing with a crazy character, they don't really try to explain that in that much detail why Malady wants to kidnap this character. But to me, it didn't really, it needed a little bit more. Even I know that she's a crazy person, but even crazy people I feel like have a little bit more internal logic, and I didn't feel like even the behind the scenes interviews really gave much clarity as to why she grabbed her. I don't feel that any of the action scenes, there were a number of fight scenes and action scenes in this episode. They were all lively and entertaining enough, but I was never really on the edge of my seat, obviously, and I didn't think any of them really had a high rewatchability factor. But as I said, I feel like this show, like it moved at a good clip. It was engaging enough while I was watching, and I'm definitely going to watch more episodes. I think that there's definitely an audience for this type of show, and I'm definitely in it. It's just a question of whether or not the Whedon taint is going to keep this show from becoming a hit, I think. But I'm not going to talk about him too much more because I feel like, you know, he's been given his walking papers. I don't think there's really much reason to dwell on him. I feel like most of the people online that are giving this a negative review, it's because they can't get over his involvement, or they think the show is too busy, which it is. But I don't know that that is necessarily an insurmountable obstacle, and I feel like it could find its footing as the season progresses. We'll have to wait and see. But let me know what you thought in the comments. If you're interested in seeing my upcoming reviews of The Nevers and other shows, please consider subscribing to the channel. And as always, thanks for watching.